What if history isn't shaped only by speeches and battles, but by the quiet decisions that happen within arm's reach? Picture a road at dusk, a marketplace at midday, a palace corridor where footsteps soften on stone. In those places, power can feel solid, guarded by walls, protocols, uniforms, and confidence. And yet, across centuries, there have been moments when all that certainty thinned to a single breath. A stranger steps closer than anyone should be allowed. A hand emerges from a sleeve. A life ends so quickly the crowd keeps moving, as if the world can't afford to pause. We tell ourselves civilization advances by making violence less personal, by turning conflict into courts, treaties, institutions. But the historical record keeps returning to a more intimate truth. Some forms of influence are designed to be close, selective, and almost invisible. Not armies, not riots, not open revolts, but networks built around proximity, groups that learned how to wait, how to blend in, how to turn trust into a doorway. In the medieval Middle East, a killing on a roadside could ripple across an empire, not because of the weapon's size, but because of the organization that placed it there. In ancient Jerusalem, a crowded festival could become a stage where fear moved faster than any messenger. In courts and confederations, in mountain provinces and trade routes, we see variations on a pattern: disciplined cells, guarded loyalties, and methods designed less to win territory than to reshape behavior. The most unsettling part isn't the violence itself, it's the design. These systems often survived because they didn't look like systems. They hid inside normal life, inside kitchens, clerical offices, pilgrim groups, merchant caravans, household routines. When authorities tightened security, the networks adapted. When leaders were removed, the networks endured. What they attacked wasn't only bodies, it was certainty. This documentary journey isn't about glorifying killers or turning rumor into destiny. It's about understanding what these shadow structures reveal about human society, how communities organize under pressure, how belief can become strategy, and how institutions respond when the threat refuses to stand still. If an empire can be made to fear a single person in a crowd, what does that say about the foundation of power and the fragile, ordinary trust that holds daily life together? What if the most dangerous weapon in a city wasn't a sword on a belt, but a knife that no one could see until it was too late? Imagine Jerusalem during a holy festival. The streets are packed shoulder to shoulder, a tide of bodies moving with purpose and prayer. Smoke rises from offerings. Vendors call out. Families look for one another in the noise. In a crowd like this, everyone is close enough to touch. That closeness feels communal until it becomes cover. Somewhere in the moving mass, a man keeps his breathing calm. He isn't dressed like a soldier. He looks like any other pilgrim. He carries no banner, makes no speech. He simply drifts toward a target, the way a leaf drifts toward a drain. Quietly, inevitably. His hand rests near his waist, where a short blade waits, curved and compact, designed for a single, quick motion. When it happens, it isn't a duel. There's no warning shout, no clash of metal, just a sudden tightening of space, a gasp that might be mistaken for surprise or devotion. Then the attacker melts back into the crowd, swallowed by the same ordinary faces that moments ago were singing. In the ancient world, groups like this weren't always recorded with clean certainty. Names change across languages. Stories carry political weight. But the pattern appears again and again. Factions operating under occupation, under religious tension, under the grinding pressure of an authority that feels distant and absolute. And within that pressure, a certain kind of logic forms, one that says fear can be a message, and a message can be more powerful than a battle. The point wasn't simply to eliminate a person, it was to make everyone else wonder who might be next. It was to stain public spaces with suspicion. If a festival could be breached, what could truly be safe? If the crowd could hide an assassin, what did it mean to belong to a crowd at all? Authorities responded the way authorities often do. Tighter patrols, harsher punishments, more informants, more rules, but those measures carried their own cost. Each checkpoint and raid widened the distance between rulers and ruled. Each new act of control created more resentment, more desperation, more recruits for the very threat it tried to erase. Violence in secret feeds on a specific fuel, the breakdown of shared trust. When trust cracks, even a harmless stranger can look like a threat. And that raises a difficult question, one as modern as it is ancient. When fear becomes a language, who decides what it says and who it turns us into when we start listening? What if the sharpest edge in history wasn't steel, but patience? High in a rugged landscape where roads narrow and horizons break into stone ridges, a fortress clings to the mountainside like a stubborn thought. It's the kind of place that looks less built than grown. Walls fitted to the terrain, watchtowers angled toward every approach, pathways that twist as if to confuse the wind. From below, it seems impossible to reach. From above, it feels impossible to forget. In one era, stories spread of a sect that turned geography into strategy. They didn't command vast armies. They didn't hold great cities. Their strength came from something quieter: discipline, belief, and a network that could extend far beyond the reach of their strongholds. The world around them ran on dynasties and taxes, on courts and caravans. They learned to run on secrecy and time. In these accounts, young recruits arrive with questions and anger, the way people always do when the world feels rigged against them. They are fed, housed, instructed. They learn codes: how to listen without reacting, how to speak without revealing, how to disappear into ordinary life. They practice restraint, not as a virtue in itself, but as a method. Because a public outburst is easy to crush, a silent plan is harder to find. Then there is the part that history and legend often tangle together: the idea of the mission. Not a charge across a battlefield, but a long journey toward a single human being. A messenger who becomes a shadow. A traveler who memorizes routines, doorways, habits, the exact hour. A target tends to pause and breathe. The act itself, when it comes, is described as close and deliberate, not cruelty for its own sake, but an argument made with a blade, an argument that says power has limits, that even kings and generals are made of the same vulnerable matter as everyone else. Whether every detail is true matters less than what the tales reveal about the era's psychology. People feared these networks not because they were everywhere, but because they might be anywhere. A servant, a student, a guard, anyone could be a doorway. And so rulers tightened their circles, built taller walls, trusted fewer voices. The organization's influence expanded without needing to conquer land, simply by changing the way leaders slept at night. But there is always another side. Within any movement built on devotion, you find human lives. Recruits who miss their families, elders who worry about the future, communities that try to make meaning out of hardship. The same structure that creates resolve can also create a kind of captivity where a person's identity shrinks until only the mission remains. It leaves us with a haunting mirror. When belief becomes a tool and loyalty becomes a weapon, Where does conviction end and manipulation begin? And if fear can make an empire tremble, what does fear do to the people asked to carry it in their hands? What if the most effective organizations don't announce themselves because the world already expects them to be invisible? Along the trade routes of the old world, power moved at the speed of animals and weather. News arrived late. Armies marched slowly. A city could believe it was safe, simply because no danger had been seen for weeks. And in that spacious delay between cause and consequence, certain groups learned to live like mist, present, influential, and hard to hold. In some places, the threat wasn't a formal army, but a disciplined brotherhood. In others, it was a loose constellation of cells, bound more by purpose than by uniforms. They didn't always share beliefs, but they shared a method: stay close to ordinary life, borrow its rhythms, wear its disguises, use its trust as a passage. A market is more than commerce, it's information. A caravan stop is more than rest, it's surveillance. A religious gathering is more than devotion, it's access. These organizations understood something that modern intelligence agencies would later formalize. The best cover is the world's own routine. If you can blend into the unremarkable, you can stand beside the remarkable. And so the stories multiply. A courier who carries more than letters. A scholar whose quiet presence masks a sharper intention. A guard who seems loyal until the moment loyalty shifts. Sometimes these tales are exaggerated. History often is. But exaggeration itself is a clue. People inflate what they fear because the unknown feels bigger than the known. When a threat has no clear borders, the imagination supplies them. Leaders respond with visible strength. They build walls, raise armies, stage trials. They want the public to see control. Yet the paradox remains. Against a hidden network, public strength can become theater. The enemy doesn't need to defeat the army head-on. It only needs to convince the leadership that any hand extended in friendship might be a trap. In this way, the organization's true target is not simply a person, but a system. It aims at the fragile seams of society, relationships, alliances, shared confidence. If those seams tear, the state becomes heavy and suspicious, and heavy states often crack under their own weight. Still, secrecy is not a magical shield. Hidden movements develop weaknesses of their own. When communication is coded, misunderstandings multiply. When loyalty is enforced, dissent goes underground. When a network is built on fear, fear can turn inward, toward comrades, toward leaders, toward the very mission that once felt clean. And then there's the most human element of all: time. Generations change, leaders die. The purpose that once seemed urgent begins to blur. A tactic that once felt necessary begins to look like habit. Violence, once justified as a message, risks becoming a language no one remembers how to translate. So we return to the road, the crowd, the corridor. We return to the quiet decisions made within arm's reach. If a society becomes obsessed with unseen enemies, how do people keep their humanity intact? And if secrecy can be used to resist oppression, when does it begin to resemble the very power it claims to fight? What if a city's greatest vulnerability isn't its walls, but its invitations? Picture a banquet hall lit by oil lamps. The air is warm with roasted meat, spilled wine, and the faint perfume of herbs crushed underfoot. Laughter rises and falls like waves. Around the tables sit men who believe they understand danger. They've survived wars, rival courts, harsh winters. They've learned to fear what is obvious. And then a guest arrives. He is polite. He bows at the right moment. He knows the names of servants, the etiquette of the room, the small jokes that prove he belongs. He offers a gift, something harmless, even thoughtful. A carved object, a folded cloth, a letter sealed with wax. In a culture where hospitality is sacred, the gesture is a key. And keys, once accepted, can open more than doors. In the ancient world, some killings were not born on battlefields, but inside the rituals of trust. The invitation itself became the first miscalculation, not because hosts were foolish, but because society depends on a shared assumption that certain spaces, homes, feasts, temples are guarded by custom. The assassin's skill was to exploit that assumption without breaking its surface. Sometimes the weapon was simple, a short blade hidden where no one would look, a cord tucked in a sleeve, poison delivered through a cup that tasted no different from the last. Sometimes the method was social rather than physical. Discredit a rival, spread a rumor, turn allies into strangers. And when the target finally fell, the message reached far beyond the body. The aftermath is always the same kind of quiet chaos. Guards blame one another. Servants are questioned until their answers become contradictions. The court splits into factions, each convinced it knows where betrayal began. Meanwhile, the organization behind it, if there was one, can remain untouched because it never needed to stand in the open. But there is a cost that rarely gets counted. When rulers respond, they often punish the very thing that makes life livable: openness. Banquets become smaller. Doors stay shut. People speak in careful fragments. Hospitality turns cautious, then cold. A society can survive fear, but it changes shape under it, becoming less generous, less curious, less willing to see strangers as human. And for the individuals drawn into these hidden roles, there's another cost: the erosion of self. To pass unnoticed, they must become a performance. To succeed, they must practice intimacy without attachment. Even if they believe their cause is righteous, the act requires a kind of inner silencing, a habit that can follow them long after the mission ends. Which leaves us with a question that echoes through centuries of close violence. If trust is one of humanity's greatest strengths, why is it so easy to turn it into a weapon? And what happens to a culture when it starts treating every invitation as a risk? What if the most frightening kind of power is the kind that never needs to raise its voice? In the oldest stories, the world is full of named monsters, creatures you can point to, warn your children about, carve into stone. But the shadow organizations of history were different. Their strength came from refusing to be carved. They survived by staying fluid, by allowing rumor to do the work that armies couldn't. Rumor travels faster than truth because it doesn't require proof. It only requires possibility. A single killing can be explained away as personal grievance. 2 killings suggest a pattern. 3, spaced just right, can feel like an invisible hand. The human mind is built to connect dots. It would rather invent a map than admit it is lost. And so, as whispers spread, people begin to see the organization everywhere, behind every sudden death, every missing courier, every political reversal. This is where fear becomes strategy, even without coordination. When leaders don't know what's real, they react to everything. They tighten rules. They accuse rivals. They pull resources from public needs into private security. In time, the state begins to behave like a fortress. Even when no siege exists, hidden groups learn to exploit that reflex. They understood that the goal wasn't always destruction. Sometimes the goal was distortion, forcing an opponent to waste strength, to mistrust allies, to turn inward. In that sense, The blade was only one tool. The deeper weapon was uncertainty. But uncertainty cuts both ways. Within any clandestine network, secrecy creates its own fog. Messages must be coded or carried by fragile chains of people who might fail, defect, or misunderstand. Plans depend on timing that weather can disrupt, that illness can delay, that accidents can ruin. And as organizations grow, they face a paradox. To expand, they need structure, but structure creates traces. The more rules, the more routines. The more routines, the more predictable they become. This is why so many such groups, real or rumored, appear and vanish in history like storms. Some burn out quickly, collapsing under pressure or internal conflict. Others persist by changing names, shifting goals, dissolving into new forms. Their survival often depends less on supernatural skill than on the ordinary messiness of the world. The fact that governments are imperfect, records are incomplete, and human beings are complicated. And still, the stories linger because they touch something universal. Every society has moments when it feels fragile, when people sense that the rules are not as solid as they once believed. In those moments, the idea of a hidden organization becomes a metaphor for all the forces we can't control: corruption, violence, betrayal, even fate. So perhaps the most important question isn't whether every whispered detail is true. It's why we keep returning to the same narrative shape. Why do we imagine power as something that can hide among us? Why does that idea feel both terrifying and familiar? If uncertainty can be engineered or even simply encouraged, how do we protect our ability to see one another clearly and to resist becoming a society that mistakes suspicion for wisdom? What if the line between hero and threat is drawn not by actions, but by who gets to tell the story? On a windy coastline, ships arrive like moving silhouettes. They carry spices, cloth, metal, letters, small objects that bind distant lives together. Ports are places of exchange, but also places of ambiguity. People come and go, names change languages, loyalties blur. It's the kind of environment where a network can thrive without being noticed, because everyone is already a stranger to someone. In times of conflict, coastal worlds produce their own shadow professions. Raiders, privateers, mercenaries, figures who exist in the legal grey between commerce and war. Some are celebrated as defenders, others condemned as criminals. Often, the difference is a flag, a treaty, a sentence, in a royal decree. This matters because not every secret organization in history is a tightly bound cult or sect. Sometimes it's a practical arrangement, a brotherhood of sailors who share intelligence, a guild that protects roots through intimidation, a band of fighters hired for deniable tasks. They operate with codes, oaths, and mutual protection. They don't need a fortress in the mountains. Their refuge is the sea's constant motion. To those they serve, such groups can look like necessity, an answer to lawlessness, an unofficial shield for trade and survival. To those they target, they look like terror made systematic. They burn villages, seize cargo, eliminate rivals. And because they move across jurisdictions, they can outrun accountability. The ocean doesn't keep records. In the historical imagination, these maritime shadows become larger than life. A single raid becomes a legend. A ruthless captain becomes an archetype. Ports whisper of hidden councils, secret maps, agreements struck under candlelight. And in some cases, those whispers are not far from truth. Where wealth moves, power follows. Where power follows, secrecy is never far behind. but the deeper pattern remains the same. These networks exploit gaps in governance. They thrive where authority is uneven, where enforcement is selective, where distance makes law feel abstract. Their existence is a reminder that order is not a natural state. It's a fragile agreement, maintained by systems that can falter. And what happens when the state tries to crush these groups? Sometimes it succeeds with overwhelming force. Sometimes it fails and ends up negotiating quietly through intermediaries. Sometimes it absorbs them, turning yesterday's outlaws into tomorrow's sanctioned agents. The shadow becomes an instrument, and the moral lines blur again, which leaves us with a complicated human truth. People often join such networks not because they love violence, but because they crave belonging, protection, and a sense of control in a world that feels indifferent. A secret oath can feel like warmth when life is cold. So when we look back, we have to ask, if an organization lives between law and chaos, how do we judge it fairly? And if the story of violence depends on who writes it, what truths are we missing about those who suffered and those who believed they had no other way to survive? What if the most enduring empires of fear are built not on weapons, but on belonging? Step into a candlelit room beneath a busy street. Above, a city hums, footsteps, carts, distant music. Below, a small circle of people sits close enough to feel one another's breath. They speak quietly, not because the walls are thin, but because secrecy changes the way language tastes. Every word carries weight. Every pause is a test. Across history, clandestine groups have often functioned like families. Not the warm, uncomplicated kind, but the kind forged by shared risk. Membership is proof of trust. Trust is proof of worth. And worth, for someone who has been ignored or hunted or humiliated, can feel like oxygen. That's part of what makes these organizations so difficult to dismantle. You can arrest individuals, break up meetings, ban symbols, but you can't easily outlaw the human need to matter. When a society offers certain people no dignity, they may seek it in spaces where the rules are different, where secrecy is not shame, but identity. Some ancient brotherhoods and militant sects used rituals to deepen that identity. Initiations, vows, coded signs, the specifics varied across cultures, but the purpose was consistent: to create a boundary between us and them. Once that boundary feels sacred, sacrifice becomes easier. Even cruelty can be framed as duty. The moral world narrows until it fits inside the group's story. Yet inside those circles, the lives are still human. People laugh, people doubt, people miss home. They fall in love, they get tired. And that human complexity is important because it reminds us that organized violence is rarely sustained by monsters. It's sustained by ordinary people who have been convinced that their violence has meaning. Authorities, fearing what they can't see, often respond by making the outside world harsher. Surveillance grows. Punishments become collective. Suspicion spreads to anyone who shares a language, a neighborhood, a faith. And with each broad crackdown, the secret group's narrative gains power. They will never accept you. Only we will. This is the trap. The more the state tries to force certainty, the more uncertainty multiplies. The more it demands loyalty, the more loyalty fractures. In the end, the hidden organization doesn't need to be stronger than the empire. It only needs the empire to become clumsy, to strike too widely, to lose moral legitimacy, to create new wounds faster than it can heal old ones. But there's another side, too. Some clandestine networks eventually soften, evolve, or dissolve, not because they are defeated, but because the world changes around them. A political settlement opens space for other identities. A new generation questions old tactics. A leader dies, and no one wants to replace them. Sometimes, peace arrives not with victory, but with fatigue. So when we study these shadow organizations, we're really studying the architecture of belonging, how it can be used to shelter, and how it can be twisted into a cage. If people will risk everything just to feel seen, what does that say about the societies that failed to see them in the first place? And what kind of belonging could we build that doesn't require an enemy to prove it's real? What if history's most effective assassinations were less about violence and more about timing? At dawn, the world is at its most vulnerable. Guards yawn. Courtiers shuffle papers. Stable hands move quietly through routine. In that thin moment between night and day, a person can cross a courtyard without being fully seen. And in eras when power depended on the body of a single ruler, the early morning was not just a time of calm, it was a time of opportunity. Many ancient and medieval societies revolved around individual authority. A king's mood could decide a tax. A general's ambition could start a war. A minister's favor could lift a family into wealth or grind them into dust. In such systems, removing one person could redraw the map more effectively than any siege. That reality shaped the logic of targeted killing. It wasn't random violence, it was a kind of political punctuation, a sudden period at the end of a sentence. Sometimes the aim was revenge. Sometimes it was survival. Sometimes it was pure ambition, disguised as ideology. But the technique required something subtler than rage. It required a deep reading of human habit. Assassins and their networks studied routines the way astronomers studied the sky. When does the target pray? When do they walk alone? Which servant brings water? Which gate is left open for convenience? Which guard is bored enough to accept a bribe, and which is proud enough to be flattered? The plan, at its best, wasn't a storm. It was a quiet alignment. And then, when the act occurred, the aftermath mattered as much as the moment. If it looked like an accident, blame spread slowly. If it looked like a rival faction, suspicion could ignite civil conflict. If it looked like divine punishment, it could shift public sentiment. The narrative of the killing became its second weapon. What fascinates historians is how often these narratives were contested. Each side told a different story. One chronicler called the assassin a martyr, another called him a coward. One court framed the death as treason, another framed it as justice. In the fog of politics, the truth was often less important than what the truth could be used for. And yet beneath all the propaganda, there is a quieter tragedy, the way the living adjust. The empty chair at the council table, the sudden promotions and disappearances, the families who lose protection overnight, the soldiers who march because someone else now holds the seal of authority. In a highly centralized system, the death of one person can turn thousands of lives into collateral. This is why secret violence can feel so destabilizing. It attacks not only the target, but the social imagination. It makes everyone aware that the future can pivot on a hidden hand, that even the most powerful are, at heart, unguarded human beings. So perhaps the most haunting question is not how these killings happened, but what they reveal about the societies that made them so consequential. If a single death can reorder an entire nation, what does that say about how fragile our structures of leadership really are? And what kind of world are we building when so much depends on one body, one heartbeat, one unrepeatable morning? What if the most important battlefield isn't a place, but a mind. There are moments in history when fear becomes a climate, not a single storm, but a season that settles in and changes how people walk, speak, and even think. Doors close earlier, voices lower. Neighbors who once shared bread begin to measure their words as if language itself might betray them. Shadow organizations, whether tightly organized or loosely mythologized, often thrived in that climate because they understood a simple truth. Humans don't just fear pain. They fear not knowing. They fear randomness. They fear the feeling that the rules have stopped working. So the goal was sometimes to make violence feel patterned, predictable in its unpredictability. A target here, a rumor there, a death that no one can explain, a warning that seems to come from nowhere. Even if the organization's actual reach was limited, the psychological reach could be vast. This is the quiet genius of intimidation. It turns imagination into an accomplice. People begin to do the work of control for you. They avoid certain streets. They stop meeting in groups. They cancel celebrations. They distance themselves from anyone who might attract attention. Without firing an arrow, the threat reshapes the daily map of a city. Governments and rulers have always tried to counter this with certainty. They announce investigations, offer rewards, stage public punishments. They promise that the danger will be contained. And sometimes those measures work. But sometimes they backfire because certainty can look like desperation. A public execution can create sympathy for the condemned. A sweeping arrest can create new enemies. A censorship campaign can make rumors feel more plausible. In trying to restore order, authority can accidentally feed the very story it wants to erase. Meanwhile, within the shadow organizations themselves, fear is also a tool of management. Loyalty is reinforced by the threat of betrayal. Silence is enforced by consequences. Members are taught to view doubt as weakness. In such environments, even friendship becomes complicated. Trust is not freely given, it is rationed. Yet people are still people, and cracks appear. A recruit falters. A messenger forgets a phrase. A leader grows paranoid. A rival cell competes for influence. The same secrecy that protects the network also isolates it. In the long run, that isolation can become its downfall, not through external attack, but through internal collapse. This is the paradox of hidden power. It demands control, but it breeds instability. It relies on humans, but it tries to suppress humanity. And the moment it begins to fear itself, it starts to unravel. So the story of these organizations is also a story about psychological endurance, about how long people can live inside suspicion before they either break or change. If fear can reshape a society without taking over its territory, what does that teach us about the real foundations of stability? And if the mind is the battlefield, how do we defend it without becoming the very thing we fear? What if the shadow doesn't disappear when the organization does? Because the shadow was never only about them. Walk through the ruins of an old stronghold. The stones are cold, softened by centuries of rain. Birds nest where watchmen once stood. Grass pushes through cracks as if the earth is patiently reclaiming what humans insisted on holding. Up close, the place feels smaller than legend promised, and yet standing there, you can still sense why people once feared it. Not because the walls were unbeatable, but because the idea behind them was. The belief that somewhere out there existed a disciplined network, waiting, watching, capable of reaching across distance and hierarchy, has a way of surviving longer than any fortress. Even after the last member is captured, even after the last leader is gone, the story remains. And stories, unlike armies, don't need supplies. This is how many secret groups become permanent residents of the imagination. Over time, historians try to separate fact from exaggeration, but popular memory does something else. It turns complexity into symbols. The organization becomes shorthand for hidden influence. The assassins become shorthand for political violence. The hidden blade becomes shorthand for betrayal. And that shorthand is dangerous because it can be reused. Later rulers borrow the fear to justify crackdowns. Later, rebels borrow the romance to recruit followers. Writers borrow the mystery to entertain. Each retelling sands away nuance and leaves a sharper outline. The group becomes less human and more mythic, either pure villain or pure hero, depending on who is speaking. But real human lives existed inside those myths. People with families, doubts, hunger, pride, communities that had to live with the consequences, targets, and bystanders alike. When we reduce them to symbols, we risk repeating their errors, because symbols don't teach empathy, they teach certainty. There is also the question of why these stories feel so contemporary. Even in modern life, we sense invisible systems at work. Algorithms, institutions, networks of influence that shape what we see and believe. The old secret organizations become metaphors for something we still feel. That power can be hidden, that history can be manipulated, that the official story might not be the whole story. Sometimes that suspicion is healthy. It keeps us curious. It pushes us to ask questions. But suspicion can also become a cage. When every event is interpreted as secret control, we lose the ability to see ordinary causes, mistakes, chance, human frailty. We trade reality for a narrative that feels more satisfying because it gives the world a single villain and a single explanation. The ancient shadows remind us of a more grounded truth. Hidden power exists, yes, but it is rarely perfect. It is made of humans, and humans leak. They argue, they fail, they change their minds. So perhaps the real lesson is not to deny the possibility of clandestine influence, but to approach it with humility. When a story becomes bigger than the people who lived it, what responsibility do we have as listeners and narrators? And how do we hold on to curiosity without letting it harden into a fear that makes the world feel simpler than it really is? What if the hardest thing to kill isn't a leader, but an idea that has learned how to hide? There's a particular silence that follows a purge. The arrests are done. The leaders are gone. The public trials have ended. Officials declare victory. And for a moment it feels as if the air itself has cleared. But beneath that calm, something often remains. A residue of method. A secret organization is rarely just a list of names. It is a pattern of behavior. How messages travel. How trust is built. How identity is protected. How fear is applied. When a group is dismantled, those patterns can survive inside the people who witnessed them. A former courier teaches his nephew how to avoid notice. A frightened merchant learns how to speak in hints. A government learns how to create informant networks. The technique spreads like dye in water, coloring both resistance and control. This is one of history's most unsettling feedback loops. Threats teach states, and states teach threats. Each side adapts, borrowing what works from the other. In some eras, you can almost watch the evolution. Authorities develop more sophisticated surveillance. Hidden groups develop deeper compartmentalization. Governments use propaganda. Networks use counter-propaganda. Each becomes more skilled at shaping perception, and ordinary people are caught in the middle, trying to live their lives while narratives collide above them. But amid all this strategy, there are human moments that don't fit the pattern. A guard who chooses mercy when he could choose punishment. A recruit who refuses to complete a mission. A leader who decides the cause is not worth the cost. These moments are harder to find in the record because they don't always produce dramatic outcomes. Yet they are important because they remind us that history is not only systems battling systems, it is also individual conscience struggling against momentum. Sometimes, the end of a clandestine group comes not through conquest, but through a slow shift in meaning. What began as a response to oppression becomes a habit that no longer has a clear purpose. What was once a tight community becomes fragmented. The next generation grows up without the same wounds, and the old justification feels distant. The organization loses its emotional fuel. Still, the memory of it can remain as a warning, sometimes useful, sometimes weaponized. People point to the past to explain the present. They invoke old shadows to justify new fears, and in doing so, they keep the cycle alive. The deeper question, then, is not only how secret violence is organized, but how societies heal after it. How do you rebuild trust once it has been punctured? How do you reopen public spaces without pretending the wounds never happened? How do you remember without turning memory into a tool for endless suspicion? Because a society can defeat a hidden network and still carry its imprint. If methods can outlive movements, what does victory actually mean? And when we inherit the fears of those who came before us, how do we decide which fears still protect us and which ones only keep us small? What if the real mystery isn't how these organizations killed, but how the world kept living afterward? Consider an ordinary morning after an extraordinary event. A city wakes up with the news already woven into it. People stand in line for bread. Children run errands. A mother braids her daughter's hair. Somewhere, a clerk opens a ledger and begins to write, because the day's work has to be done, whether the last night was calm or catastrophic. This is how history survives, through routine. When a hidden network strikes, it creates a rupture, an instant that feels like it should divide time into before and after. But the world has a stubborn habit of continuity. Life doesn't stop to admire the drama. It adjusts. It swallows shock. It makes room for grief and moves the furniture around it. And that adjustment for a society can be both resilience and loss. Resilience because people refuse to surrender their lives to fear. They keep meeting friends. They keep trading goods. They keep falling in love. They keep telling stories that remind them they are more than targets. Loss, because the adjustment often includes invisible compromises, a little less openness, a little more caution, a new habit of scanning faces, a subtle tightening in the chest when a stranger stands too close. A city can keep functioning while becoming psychologically smaller, the way a hand can still move after it has healed around a scar. Hidden organizations rely on that scar tissue. They don't need everyone to panic. They only need a permanent shift, a new baseline of suspicion. Over time, that baseline becomes culture. Children grow up absorbing it without knowing its origin. Don't talk to strangers. Don't say too much. Don't trust officials. Don't trust neighbors. Each warning feels practical, but together they form a worldview. Yet history also shows that people push back against this shrinking. Sometimes the pushback is political. Reforms, negotiations, the slow building of institutions that distribute power so no single death can topple a system. Sometimes it's cultural. art that mourns without inflaming, rituals that restore public life, shared narratives that rehumanize the other side. Sometimes it's simply the quiet decision of a community to keep gathering in public, to keep practicing trust, as if trust were a muscle that can be strengthened. Because trust, like fear, is contagious. A single act of courage, opening a door, offering help, refusing to scapegoat, can spread through a neighborhood the way suspicion spreads through a court. It doesn't erase danger, but it changes what danger is allowed to define. And this is the final turn of the story we've been tracing. Hidden violence tries to make the world feel inevitable. It tries to say, this is the only way. This is how power works. This is what humans are. But history is more complicated than that. Humans are also the ones who rebuild, the ones who choose restraint, the ones who refuse to let fear become a religion. So as we approach the end of our journey, we're left holding two truths at once: the reality of organized secrecy and the reality of human capacity to outgrow it. If the scars of the past become the habits of the present, what habits are we passing forward without noticing? And what would it look like to teach the next generation not only how to survive fear, but how to live beyond it? What if the lesson of history's shadows is not that the world is controlled, but that the world is fragile, and we are responsible for what we build inside that fragility? Return in your mind to the scenes we've walked through. The crowded festival where a single motion changed a city's mood. The mountain stronghold where discipline turned geography into leverage. The banquet where hospitality became a doorway. The port where law and chaos traded masks. The quiet room where belonging was forged into a boundary. The dawn courtyard where timing mattered more than force. These stories feel distant, but their emotional logic is familiar. They are about proximity and power, about fear and trust, about the human urge to explain what hurts us by imagining a hidden hand behind it, and about the real, documented fact that sometimes hidden hands do exist, organized, deliberate, capable of shaping events far beyond their numbers. Yet the deeper pattern is not supernatural, it is social. Secret organizations arise where people feel unheard, unsafe, or excluded, where power is concentrated and accountability is thin. They thrive where institutions fail to protect dignity, where conflict becomes permanent, where the future feels closed. They depend on the cracks in society, and they widen those cracks until the whole structure seems ready to split. But they also reveal something else: the limits of control. Even the most disciplined network is made of human beings. Even the most intimidating reputation can be undone by time, by exhaustion, by internal doubt, by the slow change of generations. No shadow stays perfectly shaped forever. The question is not whether darkness exists, but what we do with the knowledge that it does. In the modern world, we are surrounded by new kinds of invisible systems, digital networks, economic pressures, information currents that move faster than any ancient courier. We can't pretend we live in a simple era, but we also don't have to surrender to the idea that everything is manipulation, that every event is a plot, that trust is naive. History offers a more demanding kind of wisdom: skepticism paired with humility, curiosity paired with restraint, the ability to ask hard questions without turning the world into a single, comforting story. Because the danger of shadow narratives is not only that they might be true, it's that they can make us treat one another as potential threats by default. They can make fear feel like intelligence. They can turn communities into suspicious fragments, easy to control, easy to provoke, easy to isolate. So perhaps the most humanistic insight is this. The opposite of clandestine violence is not blind optimism. It is a society that distributes power, protects dignity, and creates enough belonging that secrecy is not the only shelter. It is the daily practice of building systems where fewer people feel forced into the shadows and where leaders cannot be made into gods or single points of failure. The ancient world's hidden blades remind us that civilization is not guaranteed. It is an ongoing agreement, renewed in choices that are often small, quiet, and unrecorded. And that leaves us with a timeless question, one that reaches beyond any one era. When uncertainty rises and fear offers easy answers, what kind of people do we want to become? And what kind of future do we want our trust to make possible?